Hello and welcome to the 10th episode of Hammer Time, and it is my great pleasure, after many announcements, and I can prove that it was not a lie, that today I can welcome Konstantin Kisin. And I'm twice as happy because many people in the comments said, you should have Konstantin on, and I could say, patience, it will happen, and finally it is actually happened. In this conversation, I want to start with something more uplifting potentially and something positive at these negative times, and something that of course relates very much to your original profession as a comedian. I've been working on a paper recently trying to figure out what kind of regimes, what kind of governments have been best in delivering for their people. And one correlation, maybe not a causation, I found, is the attitude of the state towards mockery, towards humor, towards giving people room to make fun of those who are in power. And ironically, very often, very brutal rulers sometimes, but you had Emperor Augustus, you had the Emperor Vespasian, you had Frederick the Great in Prussia. So not our ideal case of liberal Democrats, but they had a very relaxed attitude towards mockery, towards humor. And I'm wondering if there is maybe a correlation towards effective governance and a sense of humor, and that what we are seeing in our contemporary world is that actually governments are losing that sense of humor. I think, for example, in California, the Babylon Bee is now suing Governor Newsom over some meme issues. So that even though these democratic systems are democratic on paper, that a certain relaxed attitude towards mockery is disappearing. And I think that, of course, also then has repercussion towards free speech. Do you think I'm onto something, or is this a completely absurd assessment?
No, I don't think it's absurd. I wasn't aware of the people you mentioned, certainly the two Roman emperors and Frederick the Great being so open to mockery. I know that from a more modern perspective, I watched in Russia in the 90s the opening up of satire. We had lots of fun being made of politicians until Vladimir Putin came in. And the first thing he did was immediately shut that down. So I don't think it's a property of democracy versus not democracy exactly. But perhaps what you might be onto is that governments and rulers who feel insecure, who are not comfortable and secure in their position, they are the ones that are averse to being challenged because there's a lot to lose by having a loss of status and a loss of reputation. That could be it.
I was wondering the same thing. I mean, you see this in some other areas as well. When, for example, there's a lot of discussions going on about Western civilization, at the decline of Western civilization, and you had fantastic guests together with Francis Foster on the Trigonometry podcast, from Neil Ferguson to David Starkey to others as well. And sometimes it feels that if we look at the high tide of Western civilization, I think it would be a fair assessment to say that it was somewhere around the 19th century. But I would make the claim that this was also the time where you had people like Oscar Wilde, where satire, where a comedy was emerging. We had Johann Nestroy in Austria. And that seems to show that you can be a kind of monarchical authoritarian system, but you can gradually move in the direction of becoming freer in your attitude towards expression, that government allows more criticism, it allows more free speech. And then you can reach a point as it is now where it seems to decline. So in absolute terms, we are freer now than we were 150 years ago. But I sometimes wonder, isn't the really interesting thing the trend? Is society the tendency towards more freedom, or is the tendency towards less freedom? And in which direction do you see us move at the moment?
Well, I think the one thing that's missing from your great analysis, Ralph, that we might want to add is the context of the technology of the time. I think the reason that there is so much movement in the wrong direction, as I think you and I probably agree, in the modern Western society, is that the technology that we use to communicate has become so much more powerful that what might have been said in a pub or in a bar with no repercussions 15, 20 years ago can now be potentially broadcast to millions of people. And so the politicians seem to be very concerned about, for very understandable reasons, things like foreign disinformation. I think it's actually a very important concern. A lot of people in the free speech camp, with whom I find myself in agreement on most things, underestimate, in my opinion, how much foreign interference there is in what we hear and what we read. And so people often take a kind of absolutist position that, oh yeah, Russia Today, great, let's have them broadcasting into the Russian propaganda into our ears and into our eyes. Oh, Al Jazeera, again, this is an organization that's funded by a national government in order to mislead people. Again, let's just take the laissez-faire attitude to it. My point is that there's a lot of concerns about foreign influence and disinformation. There's also a lot of concern about people being able to broadcast inaccurate information, let's say, or the wrong opinion about certain things to a large number of people. This wasn't possible before. If you wanted to reach millions of people, you needed your own TV channel, you needed your own newspaper. Now we all have our own TV channel and newspaper in our pockets that we carry with us. So I think the technological shift has been very significant, which is probably, I suspect, actually the main reason that you are seeing these attempts to crack down on it. And that's kind of the big challenge for our society. How do we deal with the modern technology without losing our core values that we all think are important?
Do you have trust in the individual that they are capable of filtering out what is information, what is disinformation? Or I think what I'm trying to ask is, do you sometimes think that people, and I'm not excluding myself in this, I'm very much part of this, that we deliberately, you also had Jonathan Haidt on your show, for example, when we talk about confirmation biases, that we seek out information, of course, that strengthens our already existing biases, but at some point we know that that's the case. So it's not that we are entirely immune to our own biases. We know that we have them, and sometimes I feel that whether it's governments or other institutions, that they have such little trust in the people to being capable of filtering information on their own.
Well, I think most governments tend to distrust the ordinary person, and I think they are wrong to do so. Having said that, I don't trust people to always know that they're biased and always make the right decisions. I just think it's their right to be wrong and to suffer the consequences. So, during the pandemic, there was this huge debate about whether people are allowed to have this opinion or that opinion. People are allowed to take or not take the vaccine, all of this stuff. And my view was, obviously there's, the consequences for other people that sometimes can be in play. But if you choose to believe inaccurate information about a medical product or a food item or whatever, despite being told repeatedly by the government or by the authorities that it's harmful to you, and you choose to take it, well, that's on you, and you have the right to do that. In the same way that, I believe that most people should have the right to take most drugs without being criminalized for it. I'm not saying taking drugs is good. I just don't think that the government should interfere with that. There's certain exceptions to that. So it's not that I trust the ordinary person or myself, frankly, to make all the right decisions. I just really, really don't trust the government to do it for me. And I would rather make the wrong decision and be wrong and suffer the consequences than live in a world in which the government takes away all my freedoms in order to protect me from the consequences of my own bad decisions. Those are the two things that are struggling against each other, and I think the individual is, in most situations, much better placed. There are exceptions to this, but we ought to trust people. That does not mean that people are inherently trustworthy.
If being asked, would you agree with John Stuart Mill's idea that in the battle of ideas and the competition of ideas, that ultimately those ideas closest to the truth will win out, or do you think that might be somewhat of a naive humanism?
I think it's an idealized version of reality, which again fails to factor in. I keep banging on about technology, it feels like, in this short conversation. But if you think about the reality of social media, which we'll observe with our own eyes if we're on it, I would not say that it is universally true that good ideas triumph and bad ideas fail. What I would say, as I'm watching it, is that sensationalist ideas triumph and true ideas can succeed if they're sensationalist, but will usually fail if they're not. So what draws people's attention is not the truth, but it's the appeal of something, the emotional appeal. So I don't think it's always the case. If you create some kind of artificial environment, like a debate, for example, in which there's an equal footing and an equal platform, etc., in that debate, if it's conducted properly, good ideas will likely triumph. But we don't live in that idealized kind of sterile medical environment or scientific environment in which these ideas can be tested against each other in a double-blind experiment like some kind of medication. So I don't think it's true, and I think you don't have to look very far in history to see that actually there are societies in which bad ideas can take over over a very large number of people, or more likely over a very small number of people who accumulate all the power in their hands and then control the information that goes out to everyone else. There's, I grew up in the Soviet Union, which was formed in exactly this way, right? The creation of the Soviet Union was not the triumph of good ideas, and it was not maintained for 70 years by the good ideas. Now, you could argue after 70 years of bad ideas failing, reality plus good ideas won. That might be one way of looking at it, but I'm not sure that's always the case. Again, Nazi Germany was a place where very bad ideas triumphed for a very short period of time, and they were not won over by better ideas. They were won over by military force. So I think this is an idealized version of reality, but one that it is a perspective that has value, and we should remember that the best way to counter bad ideas will be good ideas, but there is also a power imbalance. There's the broadcasting technology and all sorts of other things that play into it.
And I guess it also depends a little bit on what one perceives as being the goal of a society in order to define whether something is a good or a bad idea. It was in the late 90s, an anthropologist wrote that his last name was Edgerton. He wrote an interesting book about cultural maladaptation, and he made the case that sometimes cultures create and come up with values that actually are less adaptive to their environments than other models. And I think one favorite example of mine are the Shakers, right? This religious group that can only pass on their belief via conversion. So they live it in celibacy, so you cannot be born a Shaker, and their model to pursue people to join them is, saying, come to us, there is like no fun, no sex, but lots of praying. And that worked apparently in the 19th century, but now I think I Googled it, I think there are like 2 Shakers left in the United States. I think one of them is a man, the other one is a woman, so they probably could get it going, but if they wouldn't be Shakers anymore. So I think that would be a case of maladaptation that you mentioned, so that there is no guarantee that the best ideas always win out. You spoke a lot and very eloquently, both on your social media accounts, but also on your podcast, about this debate that recently emerged about World War II and whether or not Churchill is the bad guy. And before I get into this, because I think it is an important conversation to have, or a conversation about that conversation to have, do you think that maybe COVID broke something? And what I mean by this is that the way in Austria it was the same, right? The way in which governments presented themselves to be so sure that they know all the details that then later on turned out that they didn't know. I don't want to use the word lie, but it created the impression at least that they were lying to the people. Did you have now this counter reaction that many people say, whichever narrative comes from the government, I don't believe. And if part of the narrative is that the Allies were the good guys and won World War II, and that it was a good thing that they won World War II, you say, oh no, that comes from, quote unquote, the elite, and there is an elite. I'm not entirely meaning this in a derogatory sense. And you say, oh, then it must be wrong. Do you think that this is something we see, for example, in what's currently happening with Tucker Carlson and the guest he had on his show, that this is less about historical accuracy, but more about feeding into this idea whatever comes from those in power must be wrong?
Yeah, I don't know whether Tucker Carlson specifically is a victim of this, but I think it's absolutely fair to say that the COVID broke a lot of brains. A lot of brains. And you saw it first happening actually with Ukraine, where, and by the way, it's broken people's brains in both directions. So there are a lot of people who became absolutely wedded to the idea that whatever the government is telling them must be true. And it was interesting to observe, because I don't know if you remember this, but Donald Trump was in charge of the United States when the pandemic first hit. And he was desperate for a vaccine. Desperate. And he was pushing it very hard. And so all the Democrats at the time were saying, I'm not taking Trump's vaccine. Then the party switched, and suddenly you were evil if you didn't want the vaccine, and you had to take it because that's what all good people do. So I think it broke people's brains in both directions. But the thing you're speaking to is, of course, true. There are a lot of people who temperamentally, for their own reasons, and also financially, they're incentivized to feed the thing in people which says, I can't believe anything anyone's telling me. This is the thing that really came through with COVID. I think it was a more gradual process over time. The self-destruction of the mainstream media as a reliable tool for obtaining accurate information, which had happened over the previous decade or so, was also a factor. And then, you know, for my generation, I think we're probably similar age, the invasion of Iraq was another example of when a lot of people lost faith in what they were told by government, because certainly, I don't know what the situation was like in Austria, but in the UK, it was pretty widely felt that the case for invading Iraq was completely baseless and flimsy, and yet the government lied us into it. So instead of saying what I suspect happened, which is, look, the Americans are going to invade Iraq, it is in Britain's interest to stand with America, otherwise we would lose lots of very valuable things. So we got to do this even though we don't agree with the case. The politicians couldn't make that argument, so they made up a bunch of bullshit and then basically lied to people. And you know, I was a young student at the time, but I remember thinking and probably saying to, you know, nobody, because nobody was listening to me at the time. But, you know, I thought it was a very bad idea for us to be misleading and lying, because it undermines the credibility of our governments with our citizens. It also, by the way, and this is important, undermines our ability to speak from a position of truth around the world. You know, and so you get to a position like the one in 2022, where Vladimir Putin can absolutely lie about his invasion of Ukraine, and he has done so repeatedly, and there's plenty of times when he said he wouldn't do something and then has done it, and all sorts of things. And lots of people are tempted by that because they go, well, look, we've lied about this, we've lied about that, this isn't true, this wasn't true. Every time you tell a lie, you lower your credibility in the eyes of the people who heard that lie. And during COVID, we were told, you hesitate to use the word, I think that we were told lies, and what I mean by that is not, you know, the politicians sat there and said, we know the truth is A, and we're going to tell them B, but they were very, very willing to make claims for which they had no evidence, or which had very questionable evidence, about the efficacy of masks, about whether masks work or don't work, about whether lockdowns work or don't work, about whether they kill people or don't kill people, and all sorts of other things. And I think, yes, absolutely, a lot of people's faith in not just the elites, but the kind of all the institutions that we used to have as kind of the sources of what we believed. A lot of them have undermined themselves, and I always thought that was very dangerous. It's one of the reasons I opposed it so much.
Do you think, when we look back at COVID, that one of the issues was that, without getting too philosophical, but I think it would be an interesting question to ponder, that over the last decades, maybe since the 1960s, but maybe even a little bit earlier, maybe even at the turn of the century, from the 18th to the 19th to the 20th century, that with the decline of the importance in religion, right, with the idea there is us as individuals, there are communities we work with, there is the state, but then there is some higher power, a supernatural power, if you want, that ultimately is not responsible, but that is the true power. As this disappeared, that slowly but surely the state and the government has taken over that place. And when something like a pandemic hit, that the government, the state, and those who were part of that institution, that they felt that they cannot be wrong, that they are, I'm exaggerating for dramatic effect, but they are like God in a sense, that the decisions they made, that kind of what the edicts that they published, right, that they broke no argument in a godlike fashion. But then, of course, when they turned out to be wrong, similarly to the person, I don't know, that prays every day to win the lottery or for something else, and at some point, if it doesn't happen, they say, you know what, God doesn't exist. And in the same way that if the government says, we know better, trust us, and give us even more power, and then they turn out to be wrong, that the reaction is, you know what, I no longer trust you in any area. So that there is actually, if you want, a social, cultural underpinning to this phenomenon as well.
That's interesting. I'd never thought about it like that. I have to say that doesn't ring true to me, but I'd have to think about it more to really have an opinion on it. What I would say in terms of the role of government and the loss of religion, there are other effects that I think are very significant. One of them is that we don't have, for technological and religious reasons, or non-religious reasons, we have a very uncomfortable relationship with our own mortality. And if you view your life as something that is part of a bigger journey, let's say, you know, your life on earth is part of a journey which ends when you die, but then it's continued in the afterlife and God knows what else. Then your own death in this world does not seem so important. And if you don't have that sense, if you have the sense that all you have is this life, then your behavior is going to be very different. And I think we saw, one of the things we saw during COVID was that a population of people who generally are very, very protected comparatively to history from death, disease, and other forces that are overwhelming, forces that are so powerful that they make a mockery of the idea that you're in control of your own life. You know, if you look at the 20th century, for example, people living in Europe, they endured a global pandemic, 2 world wars, and all sorts of other events that were, you know, a global depression, all sorts of other things that completely ruined the lives of many people who'd done nothing wrong, in fact, who'd done everything right all their lives. And suddenly war breaks out and they're dead, or another war breaks out and they're off in a camp somewhere, or, you know, they lose all their savings even though they're very comfortable, or they have to flee their country to survive, or whatever. So I think in previous decades, people were much more accustomed to the fact that life was unpredictable, death was just around the corner for everybody, childhood mortality was so high that actually almost everybody would have seen somebody in their family die, probably their children, at some point. And so this kind of the expectation of eternal life, which we all kind of carry within ourselves until we're suddenly confronted, and then we're like, oh my God, I've got this thing, I'm mortal, is different. And then the other thing I think that has happened is, partly because of that, but partly for lots of other reasons, is that because we have the expectation that everything should be fixable and our life should be under our control, we see every problem as caused by government very often, and if it's not, even if it's not caused by government, to be solved by government. So I suspect that when the Black Death or the plague came to Europe, I don't know, I haven't read about it, I might be completely wrong about this, but I don't imagine people were sitting there going, oh yeah, you know, the government should have had a better pandemic prevention strategy.
Why doesn't the king do more for me?
Right. They had some other pathologies. They looked for scapegoats and people to blame it on, and a lot of people would have said, you know, we've displeased God or the gods or whatever. All of that would have happened. But what they might not have said is, you know, the chief health officer of our country, if there was such a thing, you know, failed, and that's why everyone's dead. Whereas now we kind of see every problem. You know, I saw this in the UK and after the invasion of Ukraine, when energy prices went up very significantly, and suddenly everyone was saying, oh, we've got to protect people against the increase in energy prices. We've got to protect people against this. We've got to protect people against that. And it sounds kind of harsh and cruel when I say, well, maybe it's not the government's job. Maybe we all have to recognize that prices go up and down, and so we shouldn't spend money we don't have, and be careful and set money aside, even if that's difficult, which I know for many people it is. And I say this as someone who has been very poor in many periods of my life and more rich in others, and so I kind of know what that's like. I'm not I'm not a rich person talking about it from that position. I just think if we can't expect the government to fix every problem, and we do.
Kind of adding on to what you just said about things in previous times, do you believe it be justified to say that maybe there was also an assumption that most likely life is not fair? And what I mean by this is that it's not so much that no, that good things are handed to you. It's kind of how you develop if bad things are handed to you. I think Theodore Roosevelt, there's one very great quote of him where he says in it that many people have to struggle with many problems, with many issues, and he admires those who actually go through it in a stronger way. And because this brings me to your most recent, and if I remember correctly, your most commented on and most read Substack, where you wrote about your position on the Israel-Palestine conflict, what's going on in the Middle East. And kind of one thing that every time I hear of this conflict, and I'm curious to hear your take on this, is I'm reminded a little bit of, like, and we had this also just a little bit with the Tucker Carlson conversation, like World War II seems to be with us all the time. But of course, you could make, as some have, and I say this very carefully because I don't want to create a wrong impression here. But of course, you could make the impression that, of course, after 1945, a significant number of Germans were driven out of Poland, of Bohemia, of these areas, and they did live there for centuries. You could make the claim that these were original German lands. But it didn't stop there, right? What then happened is they were driven out of these countries, and very quickly they reintegrated in other parts of Germany, in Austria, and wherever they moved. They were frustrated, kind of they tried to hold on to their traditions, but ultimately a pragmatic approach was chosen, right? This was horrible what happened. It was unfair that just one part of Germany was punished more than the other. The same, of course, with Eastern Germany compared to Western Germany, but there was a certain pragmatism. And when I talk to students about this, they say, yeah, but this was so long ago. But you could say, well, it's almost exactly the same time when the beginning of the Israel-Palestine conflict starts. And why was one side kind of taking a certain pragmatic approach and the other one is not? Because life is unfair. Like, there are, unfortunately, and I don't mean it's a justification, the Kurds don't have a state, right? The Scots don't have an own state. And as I said, I don't want to, this is such a difficult conversation always, but do you think that sometimes the problem is the past is important, history is crucial, but if you never let go of it, then there is never any moving forward. Doesn't matter what the conflict might be.
Yeah, I think you make an absolutely fantastic point there, Ralph. I really do. And I think if you think about what the great myth of Western democratic liberal societies is today, it's the myth of equality. And what people have confused is the promise of equal treatment with a de facto equality in practice. And we are not born equal, and therefore equality is not possible. But the reason that we, just finishing off the point we were discussing before about wanting the government to step in, the feeling is, a lot of people seem to have this feeling, that if life is unfair, that's because the government's failed you. The government has failed you. And so the government's job is to step in and provide whatever is missing. Whereas I agree with you. I think it's inevitable that life is unfair. And your point about the German people is absolutely well taken. I think if you... There are a lot of points about World War II that are often forgotten, because I agree with people that sometimes there's a very rosy, one-dimensional view of the history of that period. And it's absolutely true that Germans, what happened after World War II is that lots and lots of German people were left outside of Germany, and where they were, by the way, badly treated. And so one of Hitler's ambitions was to reunite those people. Having lost World War II, the arrangements that had been put in place after World War I were effectively reinforced and in fact added to with the splitting of Eastern Germany and Western Germany. And as you say, over the same time period as in Israel, the German people seem to have accepted this. I suspect partly it's because of the shame and guilt of Germany's conduct in World War II. That's probably one of the reasons. And of course, the Western powers, they simultaneously repeated the Treaty of Versailles, but also didn't. And what they did is they did make sure that Germany would not rise again, but also did so while making sure that German people were not resentful of what happened. And so they made sure that they were well provided for and rebuilt Germany and made it into a member of, one of the biggest and most powerful countries in Europe again, which is what it is today. But your point about the unfairness of life is so interesting when it comes to Israel, because it's not an issue I've really thought about until about a year ago, we had one or two guests in the past, and I was always kind of truthfully. A lot of Israelis don't like me saying this because my ancestry, my grandfather was an atheist Jew in the Soviet Union, and so everyone assumes suddenly I'm I'm pro-Israel all of a sudden. People who like Israel and people who hate Israel both assume that. But actually, my attitude has always been one of, truthfully, what I think most people in the West attitude is one of ignorance and not a huge amount of interest, truthfully. To me, Israel is a country far away to which I've never been, and it wasn't that important. But the arguments that have been made over the course of the last year, I've just tried to analyze them rationally. And one of the things that people always say about Israel who want to, say that Israel is doing something wrong or that October 7th was in some way understandable or whatever, and I talk about this in an article, as you know, is that Israel is illegitimate. The creation of the State of Israel is illegitimate. And I don't know if that's true, and I don't think actually it's that important whether that's true or not, because the creation of almost every country in which anyone who's watching or listening to this is the same. The United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, every country in South America and Central America, and by the way, on a long enough timescale, every country in the world was created through some kind of conquest, colonization, or whatever. So the question is, if your country was conquered or your people were displaced 75 years ago in some way, like the example you gave with the Germans who lived outside Germany, what today is Germany, do we want to encourage people to go back 75 years or 200 years or 500 years and to redraw the lines on the map? We can, but the consequences of that will be what we saw in Europe in the 1930s and 40s and what you're seeing in Gaza today. And the point I made in the article as well is, ultimately, when you start killing people, when you start targeting innocent civilians, all of this goes out of the window. No government is going to tolerate, there is no better case for the illegitimacy of a country's creation than the United States. And the woke left have been making this argument for a very long time, as you know. Does that mean that Native Americans we should accept Native Americans breaking out of reservations, slaughtering civilians, taking hostages to lift their occupation and oppression? I mean, no one has a better case than them, as far as I can tell. But the United States government wouldn't tolerate that. And neither would the Austrian government, and neither would the Russian government, and neither would the British government, neither would anyone else. So I just think this attempt to undo history, like, I'm not Palestinian. Maybe it's not my place to tell them what to do. But what I can say is, if you behave in the way that they did on October 7th, you should be extremely unsurprised when Israel behaves in the way that it has done in the last year since.
Well, maybe I would add one thing, and I feel that might apply to Russia as well as it applies to many regions in the Middle East, which is, and also, by the way, I think a little bit to Europe. There is this idea that countries, they had empires and that made them powerful. But I think this is putting the cart before the horse. Countries are powerful and then they get empires. Because if you take what everyone thinks about the conflict, I feel like I'm not well versed in it, and I don't want to tell anybody what they have to feel and what they have to think. But I will make one argument that I would stick to that, which is, let's assume that tomorrow the Israelis say, you know what, it was true, we made a mistake, 9 or 7 million Jews and 2 million Israeli Arabs, they pack the stuff together, they leave, and let's say they come to Europe or wherever, it doesn't matter. And then finally you have from the river to the sea. I don't think that all of a sudden Hamas will say, aha, and now we will build a first-rate economy in this area with, startups. And yesterday I was the jihadi, and today I'll be the undersecretary for sewage treatment or something. I don't think it works like this. And by the way, I feel, and this is why I'm curious about your take, I think this is the same that Russia is doing, right? So Russia has massive internal problems, and in kind of historical continuity, they say, how do we solve the domestic internal problems? Let's expand. Because if we are bigger, this means we are stronger. But it's kind of, as I said, putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah, and also one of the things that I think is a great parallel between Russia and Hamas is that the desire to pursue these conflicts in the way that they're being pursued is also partly based on the importance of maintaining the popularity of the people who have power today. Vladimir Putin didn't really have a problem with his popularity until about 2014, 2013, when Russia had been so prosperous for so long that people started asking the question, well, look around, all these other countries around us who were part of the same bloc as us, they are moving in a Western direction. They're moving in a democratic direction. And now that we are comfortable, why do we need this authoritarian dictator in charge for this many years? So what do? You create an external force which you then react against, and you say, we must unite around me in order to deal with it. And Hamas is the same. I mean, the leaders of Hamas, those of them who are still alive, are not in Gaza. They live in 5-star hotels in Qatar, and they're all billionaires. And that's not because the people of Gaza have rewarded them for their great services, as you say, as the Undersecretary for Sewage Treatment. It's because they've taken the proceeds of the resistance, so to speak, all the international aid and all this other stuff and the Iranian money, and they've put it in their own pockets. And so there are a lot of incentives for these bad actors to maintain the conflict and to keep it going in order to benefit themselves. By the way, I know plenty of Israelis who feel that that's also true of Netanyahu. That Netanyahu is keeping the conflict going because it benefits him personally. I don't know whether that's true, but that is something that a lot of people will often feel. So yeah, there's definitely that angle to it as well. And of course, the other point is what Russia is doing in Ukraine is exactly the same thing. This used to be our land. I mean, Putin has said this repeatedly. And by the way, he's not factually incorrect in the same way that Hitler was not factually incorrect when he said that portions of Germany and the German folk were cut off from the motherland, or from the fatherland in the case of Germany. He was absolutely factually correct, but does that mean that you get to invade all of Europe to redraw the maps as you wish? That's really the debate. And so, I mean, Putin, when he talks about the fact that many Ukrainian cities were founded under Ekaterina the Great and Catherine the Great, yeah, it's all true. The question is, how many times do you get to redraw the map that was accepted in 1991 or before then? And it just seems to me like, a lot of people who, particularly who support Russia and Hamas, ironically, call themselves pro-peace. They're pro-peace. It seems to me that the best way to achieve peace is to accept the reality of where you are and then try to build from there. And that sometimes means people on different sides of different conflicts swallowing a lot of unpleasant realities. The reality for Palestinians is 9 million people in Israel are not going anywhere. Yeah. They're just not. It's just not going to happen. And so you can globalize the intifada and you can chant from the river to the sea and you can do whatever. But you've got a very powerful country comparatively in Israel that if you keep attacking it and killing the citizens will destroy you. And it just doesn't seem to me to be the rational way to proceed in this situation. But they're free to do whatever they want to do and suffer the consequences, as we talked about earlier.
I mean, just as a last note on Russia as well, I mean, there seems to be a case of cognitive dissonance as well, because if you listen to Putin, it sounds like it's very difficult to have a, let's say, 1940s political program with a 2024 demographic conditions. I mean, Hitler at least could say that it's the famous Volk ohne Raum, people without space. But nowadays it's more the other way around. We're talking about space without people. So even if Russia would conquer its neighbors, who is going to live there? There are barely enough Russians around to live in Russia, much less to live somewhere else.
Well, this is one of the things that I find so interesting is that, a lot of countries are having demographic problems, killing hundreds of thousands and maiming probably hundreds of thousands as well of your young men. Doesn't seem to me like a good strategy. And as you say, the thing with Russia is it is a country that's incredibly rich in resources, and if it spent the huge amounts of money it is now spending in Ukraine on developing the country, it would be a much better investment of its wealth. And by the way, the one thing that people don't understand is that Russia has become quite prosperous relative to where it was in the 90s under Vladimir Putin, but it hasn't become prosperous because it has developed an economy. Russia is a big gas station. It digs things out of the ground and then sells them abroad. It hasn't developed industry on a level that would be worth talking about. It exports raw materials. It's basically a banana republic that just happens to have oil instead of bananas. And if the people who were in charge of Russia had taken those trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars and had actually invested them in building infrastructure and building industry and building some kind of innovative capacity, industrializing the country in that way, investing massively in education and healthcare and all these other things, then the appeal of invading other countries and doing all of that would have been a lot less. But a lot of that money was spent on other things or put in other pockets, and so you get what you get.
I mean, they have one industry, right? And that's an arms industry. So this is what I think the one industry they maintained over time. But you make a great point, and I hope I'm not being inappropriate here, but to quote Osama bin Laden, who once said that if people see a strong horse and a weak horse, they instinctively prefer the strong horse. And I think that is partially true in politics as well. So if I'm, and this is the thing where I'm not sure if he's overeducated or if he just reads a lot but does not necessarily understand it. I know that's a hard thing to say. But if Putin is really this well-versed individual in history, he must know, looking at Europe, that if you become the strong horse, there will be a point where others say, you know what, we actually want to join you. So if he would have built up Russia, exactly as you said, kind of from a gas station with an arms manufacturing into an actual successful economy, I could absolutely imagine that at some point Ukraine would have said, maybe not reunification, but some kind of association, some kind of, Eastern European, the group of independent states. I mean, these things were there. But of course, now this relationship is potentially broken forever because it's like, there's a horrible example, but I hope that you know what I mean. It's like you meet a person whom you like, you meet a woman that you like, and then you say you can charm her, you can woo her, you can make her fall in love with you. I think that would be the more appropriate strategy than following her at night and then force yourself on her. And this is a little bit, I think, what Russia has been doing with Ukraine. And we know from German history, you can be split up into many small kingdoms and duchies and everything. But at some point, right, if everybody does it right, you or Italy, you come together voluntarily. So very often people that pretend to be so well versed in history draw the entirely wrong lessons.
Yes, but you've got to remember that there's Russia and Putin in particular are steeped in a paranoia about America. And so when they see Ukraine and Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania and lots of other countries in their orbit moving away, they don't think, how do we make Russia such an appealing country for people outside of Russia that they're naturally drawn back towards their ancestral home? They think the evil Americans are propagandizing and infiltrating the minds of Ukrainians to pull them away from the bosom of Mother Russia. And that's why, instead of thinking logically as you are, it is much more a case of, well, this is being stolen from us. They don't even see Ukrainians as having any agency in this. They see America stealing something and them resisting and taking it back. That's how they think about it.
So would you think, because this dovetails nicely into the final point of our conversation I would like to have, that this idea that America and increasingly I have to admit, unfortunately also the Jews are responsible for everything, and the only two groups in this world that have any agency are either the Americans or the Jews. It's very odd. Like, there are people whom, again, I actually think are fairly smart, but you look at what they write and what they say, it's always that either a victim, a vassal, or a stooge of the Jews and the United States of America. And it seems that even within the United States and within Europe, that thinking is also increasing. Or maybe it's just a new algorithm on social media, I don't know. But there is, and I know you wrote about this and and I remember you, I forgot with whom you hosted a debate on such a topic, that there is a strong sense among a not small number of people who have a large audience that I think genuinely believe this.
Yeah, I don't know that it's a large number of people. I think it's a very small number of people. But I agree with you that the phenomenon is there and it's interesting. I think that when things are difficult, and it comes back to our conversation of the plague and the Black Death, not very bright people look for one factor, unifactor analysis. And this is, you know, as you know, I've made a career of criticizing woke people, and they are people who often will suggest that everything is to do with racism, or everything to do with colonialism, or everything to do with imperialism, or everything to do with capitalism. And they think about things in this one-dimensional way. When things are difficult, people always look for a simple explanation, and the simplest possible explanation, one that's been historically tried repeatedly, is that there is a group of people who are plotting and conspiring to make the world the way that it is. And if you're not very bright, and if you haven't read enough, and if you haven't thought carefully enough about a lot of things, it's very tempting, because we think it's much more comforting, I think, to think that the world is controlled by a small group of people who are nefariously doing something, than to reckon and confront the chaos of reality. You know, your life is incredibly not within your control. And that's a very painful realization, because if you think about, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, you know, we spend quite a lot of time, I'm not saying everybody, but I think most people spend a lot of time doing everything they possibly can to get as much control over their life as they possibly can. So you earn money. Why do you earn money? So that you're safe. Safe from what? Unexpected things happening. You're safe from, you know, injury, disease. You're safe from an accident. You're safe from members of your family falling ill or whatever. We spend our life trying to accumulate connections and resources and influence in order to get our life under more control. And yet, our lives are not under our control. You could, you know, I know, for example, someone who's literally a billionaire, who is dealing with health issues that no amount of money can solve. I know people who are not very wealthy, but who have great health at the same age. You know, our lives are just, they're not in anywhere near in our control as much as
they're not fair.
They're not fair. But that's very uncomfortable. And it's very hard to accept, especially if you've had this idea of equality drilled into your head since you were about 2 years old in kindergarten. You know, everything's supposed to be fair, and it's not. Well, it must be the Jews. Like, that's sort of how I see it. I just think the Jews, but it's not just the Jews. You know, if you read Thomas Sowell, he talks about, he has a great chapter in one of his best books. And the chapter is called Are Jews Generic? And he talks about the fact that all over the world there are what he calls middlemen minorities, groups that are slightly outside of the mainstream society, who fulfill very important functions that are different to what the rest of society does. And typically, whenever there's any kind of problem, whether it's disease, whether it's economic strife, whatever, those groups are then blamed and treated harshly, whether it's by the rulers or by the populace. So the foreign-born Chinese in Asia fulfill this role. East Asians in Africa, you know, Idi Amin, for example, persecuted them because they were playing that role. And the Jews are just one of the other groups that people blame. In the Western world, it so happens that the Jews are the ones that we focus on, but in other parts of the world, it's others. So it's like, you know, I remember a long time ago, I used to, anytime I'd like, you know, if I was hammering a nail in and I hit my finger, or if I stubbed my toe, my wife would be like, "Are you okay?" And I'd be like, "No," and I'd react. And then I said to Sweetie, you know, it'd be a lot better if when that happens, you don't say anything to me, because otherwise, when you speak, I just, like, that's, my brain just goes, you know, you somehow made this happen, just because these two things happened at the same time. You know what I mean? And it's this kind of like, something unpleasant happened, somebody must be to blame. It's a very comforting story to tell yourself. And then there are some groups that fit that outsider mold better than others. And of course, with America, it's a slightly different story. America is the most powerful country in the world, so it's very convenient to blame all the world's ills on America.
It's interesting, and I know we're almost close to the finish of our conversation. So much more I would love to get to, but usually when we talk about the concept of woke, it was connected to the political left. And you have also written very insightful recently, and I think very important, about a similar phenomenon emerging on the right, whether you want, some call it reactionary right, the woke right, but this idea, exactly as you just described it, seems no longer be limited to one side of the political aisle. It seems to be increasingly appear on both sides.
Yes, and one of the things that bothers me the most is that people on both the woke left and the woke right have absolutely no interest in the truth. In fact, they both believe that the truth doesn't exist. This comes back to our discussion we just had about, World War II and stuff like that. The pretty sensible and rational argument, whether you're on the center right or the center left, is the way we've been taught history is not perfect. There are things that probably got missed. It's very difficult to teach the complexity of half a century's worth of history to 12-year-olds in a few history lessons at school. So of course it's kind of one-dimensional, and there's things that we could add and subtract and look at differently and whatever. But this idea of deconstructing is very powerful on both the extremes of the left and right. And what deconstructing says is there really is no truth. Everything you've been told is a consequence of power. Whoever was in charge brainwashed you with their version of history because they wanted to make you believe certain things that are convenient for them. And that's where I see a lot of the sort of the conspiratorial thinking coming in. So that's one aspect of it, and there are a lot of other parallels with it that come with it as well. It was interesting because on social media, when I wrote that article, a lot of people came after me and started saying things like "read the room" and lots of other things, and I was like, that's exactly what the woke left was saying to me 8 years ago when I said wokeness was a problem. So there's a lot of this tribalistic stupidity. And it bears many of the same hallmarks. If you remember, the woke left spent a lot of time destroying our conception of our own history. And Churchill is a very good example of this. So that you no longer had anyone you could really say, well, this is the hero that we aspire to. This is what is a good thing about our civilization. And the woke right is the same. Now, their reasons are different. They are so fed up of what they would see as the decline and the degradation of Western civilization, that they no longer see it as worth saving. They want somebody to come in and sort it all out with an iron fist. And of course, we have some precedents historically for what that looks like. But the motivation is different, but the methods are very similar. Let's rewrite history in a way that's much more suited to what we want to say, because there is no truth really. Is there? It's just perspectives, and here's our perspective: how actually Churchill was the bad guy, and Hitler really wanted peace. I mean, obviously, as we know from history, all his behavior is entirely consistent with wanting peace.
I mean, I didn't think I would ever live to see the day where it's the Americans. I'm as the Austrian have to tell my American friends that no, Hitler really was the bad guy. That the idea to kind of rewrite it. If all of a sudden the German-speaking side were actually the good guys. Who knows? It's a very odd thing that's going on. Now, I know we're out of time. There would be so much more to talk about. I'll just re-invite you again on the podcast. I think we covered a lot of the bigger picture issues. There would have been much of more details I think we'll have loved to talk about. But this was great. Thank you so much for coming on, and I hope we have the time and we'll see each other again soon.
Great to see you, Ralph. Thanks for having me.